Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time zone from which you are watching us. And welcome to the Center for Global Development and to this conversation, which I'm really looking forward to having with John Norton. John Morton is the counselor on climate at the US Treasury. And I think that is the first time that somebody has been appointed to that role. And that in a way already speaks to some of what we're going to talk about, which is the importance of this agenda, not just for the United States Treasury, but for the administration as a whole. John brings to this role 25 years of experience in emerging markets, dealing with finance, climate, with energy, in the public sector, in the private sector. So really extremely well qualified to bring this range of expertise and background to the current agenda at a time when the agenda is so high up on the administration's priorities here in the US and on the global priorities. And yet there are questions that we will explore about just how much progress we are making, we can make. So, John, welcome to the Center for Global Development. Very happy you're here.
Pleasure to be here.
Should we just jump right in, I think?
Absolutely.
I would say, first of all, it is a new role, a new post. There's you as the counselor. There's also a climate hub now in the Treasury. Just give us a little quick snapshot of what is the nature of that role? What is it that you do in relation to others? And,
Sure.
And how does that help the agenda go forward?
Good. Happy to do that. And thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. And thanks for the invitation to be with you in the audience as well. First, let me start by saying that I think CGD occupies a uniquely important role in this ecosystem. And I think a lot of the priorities that we work on in Treasury as they relate to climate and development finance more broadly are ones that CGD has been a leader on over many years. And so we are building on the backs of thought leadership and action from your organization as I think about my role at Treasury. So first, kudos to CGD and to you for your leadership in this area. I oversee something called the Climate Hub, which is a very small team within Treasury, and our mission is to manage and coordinate Treasury's climate strategy, to agitate for ambition within the department, and to help represent Treasury's climate equities within the interagency and within external stakeholder groups like this. We know as a government and as a department that to meaningfully address climate change, we need to alter the flows of capital that are moving around the world to the tune of trillions of dollars a day. And Treasury's goal, therefore, as our overarching climate goal, is to enable and expedite the net zero market transition while protecting the safety and security of the U.S. financial system. Those are two things that are core to Treasury's mandate. And so our role, my team, works with teams across Treasury, whether it's on the international side and all of the work that we do through the development banks and the international financial institutions, or whether it's through our tax policy, our budget work, or our financial stability work that we do via the Financial Stability Oversight Council, the FSOC, which the Secretary Yellen chairs and consists of the independent regulators, all of whom are now increasingly looking at climate change as a risk to the stability of the U.S. financial system. So it's a broad-reaching role. It's a small team, but it's a coordinating and an agitating role and pushing for greater ambition. And frankly, we couldn't have a more impressive set of administration policies on one hand and leadership with Secretary Yellen to help steward that agenda. It's been a very busy first 18 months, and we'll have a chance to talk about some of the things we've done, not just on the international front, where CGD, I think, lives and dwells, but also on the domestic front, where we've seen a lot of very important action that arguably will have as much, if not more, impact on capital flows and the flow of institutional money that at the end of the day, the pace of which will determine whether we are successful in reaching Paris goals, keeping to 1.5 degrees warming, and all the other global goals that we've set. So very busy agenda domestically, internationally, and a real pleasure to have the opportunity to go into some more detail with you over the course of the next hour or so.
Well, let's go into some of that detail, and I think let's maybe before we get into the international, because that's really what I would like us to focus on. That's what we at CGD are particularly keen to go down into, drill down a bit more. Just a little bit on the overall domestic agenda as well, and President Biden has made very ambitious commitments, both domestically, internationally, and as you say, the leadership is there, and your appointment, the creation of the Climate Hub, all a manifestation of that. Secretary Kerry was here 2 weeks ago, and he also laid out a very much sort of ambitious agenda, and yet. The response from Congress so far has been, I would say, modest at best, and that was even before the focus on energy and energy security and the need to have energy independence from Russian oil and gas exports. There's sort of like a big push now to actually increase energy supplies, including hydrocarbon energy supplies. And while a lot of people talk about how this is an opportunity for us to pivot away from hydrocarbons towards a much more sustainable source of energy mix going forward, what you see is everybody's looking to see how quickly you can get oil production up everywhere. How do you, I mean, you said on the one hand and on the other hand, now, economists are two-handed, I'm going to be three-handed and say, but on the third hand, you don't really see that shared ambition, shared commitment. And now even more so because of the follow-up to the war and the invasion of Ukraine, sort of like, let's put this on hold. How much is there a danger of disconnect between ambition and goals and outcomes?
I'm not going to try to escape that question, but I'm going to answer your first question first and then come back to that question, because obviously that last question is key and front and center in our mind. I think you started by asking a question about what's happening on the domestic front and some of the domestic, which is related to the second question, obviously. So let me take a moment to say what we have been able to do, despite a divided Congress, and I think, frankly, as folks have well seen, certainly the administration's ambition on climate, particularly related to some of the domestic spending priorities, has been ahead of where Congress has been willing to go so far. We're still hopeful that we may see some progress in the coming months. And notwithstanding that, we have made already historic investments on the domestic front into climate infrastructure on the home front. So let's not forget that we've made tremendous progress in a relatively short period of time, despite a Congress that is sometimes divided on this issue. But so what have we done over the last year that I think is notable that I would highlight, and then we can discuss the overflow of the overlay of the current energy market situation on our climate priorities. So I think probably most notably, as I mentioned before, Secretary Yellen chairs something called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, and in her first meeting of that council, and that's a council whose members are the SEC, the Fed, the FDIC, the OCC, the alphabet soup of independent regulators who regulate U.S. financial markets, ensuring stability of the system. In March of last year, her first meeting of the FSOC, she put climate change front and center on the agenda, driving that agenda through the year. And in October of last year, the FSOC, for the first time ever, their members found that climate change was an emerging risk to the stability of the U.S. financial system. That finding compels a certain number of actions. That finding, along with 30 recommendations in that FSOC report, have set in place a series of work streams in those independent regulators, all related to further strengthening the focus on, the systems on, and the personnel focus on the extent to which climate change poses a risk to the financial system. I think that is a work stream and a finding that will have significant and positive consequence as regulators push for additional data availability so that investors can understand the risks that they face related to climate change in their portfolios. And so that is a meaningful step forward that has been done quite openly and prominently, and under the Secretary's leadership. We chair something called the Financial Literacy and Education Commission, or FLEC, where we are looking, Treasury is looking very hard at the impacts of climate change on disadvantaged communities, communities of color in particular, and we'll come up with, by later this year, a series of recommendations to address inequities in how climate change affects disadvantaged communities here in the US. We administer programs to the tune of billions and billions of dollars under the American Recovery Law, which are geared towards supporting resilience investments in communities around the country. And through our Federal Insurance Office, which is a Treasury managed team, we are doing quite a bit of work this year that I think will bear some interesting findings later in the year about the extent to which there may be regulatory and supervisory gaps in the insurance market as it relates to climate-related risk. And so all of those issues, which are fundamentally about understanding climate change's impact on communities, people, investors, and taking action toward them, have been occurring quite rapidly, despite some of these partisan tensions that you alluded to earlier. So that's my first part of the answer. On the other side, clearly the situation, I think, in Russia and Ukraine complicates our agenda, as it complicates so many other agendas. Right. We're not unique in that role, for sure. I think, I was in Asia. I was out in Asia when the war broke out, and it was interesting to see the reactions on the ground among our government counterparts in Asia. And I was in three separate countries during a 10-day period. In each country along the way, people realized that there needed to be short-term adjustments very quickly. But in no country I was in was there a questioning of the long-term direction of travel of country net zero commitments, right, or the rationale for more aggressively building out energy sources that are domestically controlled, right, that are clean, that are green, that are sustainable, and that are future-oriented as opposed to yesterday-oriented. So I do think we have a short-term problem here. But I have not sensed hedging at the government level or at the corporate level among the large financial institutions that have made net zero commitments. No one is saying we no longer stand behind them. People are saying there may be an adjustment period, there may be a short-term spike. I would anticipate we're going to see an emissions increase over the next year, potentially two, as countries keep their dirty assets online longer, look for fossil supplies to deal with this short-term instability. But I'm not concerned yet that we're going to see long-term spillover effects on the climate. In fact, I think we're going to see the other, which is what we've already seen in Europe, a redoubling of commitments to a green and transformative agenda.
Well, that would be a good outcome, I think, if we can get there. And let's hope that, in fact, people keep their eye on that ball. I saw a report not so long ago here about a couple of the large financial institutions finding that their investors, their shareholders, weren't supportive yet of their moving away from financing fossil fuel projects. So part of the agenda, it seems to me, is also going to be just getting broad base of understanding. The institutions, the financial institutions, report not just to the regulators, but also to their shareholders. That's right. Some of them aren't yet convinced. And indeed, there are still people who will argue that financial regulators really should be focusing on stability in the next decade, and to burden them with the extra responsibility of trying to define and then regulate for the potential risks and to the asset portfolio of the institutions they regulate that may come about in 2 or 3 or 4 decades from climate change is just not where we should be putting our energies. And I think that's just really a body of opinion one still has to deal with. How much is the Financial Stability Council and the Financial Literacy work trying to go beyond the immediate proxies, if you like, the financial institutions themselves, to try and get this broader awareness and broader understanding that would enable action to happen?
It's a great question, and I think you're right. You characterized nicely one stream of thought or criticism or concern about the direction of travel of certain regulatory bodies. I guess I would respond by simply stating, the most common thing that I hear in my interactions with corporates and financial institutions is that they would like regular, comparable, high quality, and decision useful information about climate risk in order to make decisions about how to allocate capital. That is a broad, consistent, daily input that we hear at Treasury and that Secretary Yellen hears and that FSOC members hear. So the notion that somehow asking for data, comparable data, decision-useful data from large financial institutions, the notion that somehow that is overreach, when indeed regulators' very mandate is to protect the stability of the financial system. And if regulators have determined that climate change poses an emerging risk to the stability of the financial system, how can you protect against that risk without better data? Now, there will be scrambles and disputes about how much data and what type of data, but that's very much the issue that the regulators are grappling with here. Their job is not, and their goal is not to be overreaching. They're not trying to, I believe, set up a fiefdom that is unrelated to the stability issue that they're seeking to solve. Last year, Masood, we had, as you probably well know, and CGD probably tracks well, we had in 2021 we had $20 billion plus insurance events in terms of climate-related damages and losses. The average annual loss for the last 5 years has been over $150 billion in climate-related damages in this country alone. Does anyone expect those numbers are going to get smaller? I would hasten to say
bet on it.
Probably not. Yeah. So I mean, these risks are not future, as you said, 20, 30 years out. They're here today, and they're affecting capital flows. They're affecting insurance markets, and yet we don't have good data to measure them and predict them. And so that's really what I believe the first step of a strong regulatory agenda needs to be. Let's get data, let's disclose that data, and that's something certainly the Secretary has spoken frequently about.
Right. And then let's use that knowledge to define what is the right approach.
That's right.
So the alternative to overreach is not underreach, right? It's to basically define what is the right approach. And I find this argument is made in so many areas where people sort of put up this straw man at the end and say, well, you couldn't possibly want all this. And nobody's actually suggesting that. The question is, there is some reasonable approach where you look at the risks and then you calibrate a response accordingly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Should we move a little bit, John, to the international side
Absolutely.
now? And I want to start with the sort of broad question, if you like. If you look at what's going to happen to emissions over the next 2 decades, the bulk of the increase in energy use, in GDP, in infrastructure being laid down, is all going to happen in emerging markets and the developing world countries more generally. And there are the choices they make in terms of the technologies they use, in terms of the way in which they factor in the emission consequences of their energy and land use and other choices will have an impact on the planet and its livability for the foreseeable future. And what I find interesting is that there's a lot of studies now of the massive amounts of financing that will be required, massive in relation to what these countries have been able to mobilize, not massive in relation to what we in capital, the countries where capital is more easily accessible, have been able to use for, not least for fighting the pandemic. And so there's numbers like you need $5 trillion by 2030, or you need between 2.5 and 4 trillion even earlier as investments to support this. So one is sort of estimates of need, very large numbers. The second is numbers around potential availability of funds. Just to pick one, there's 130 trillion that the Mark Carney has been citing as part of this coalition of investment asset managers and the like. And there are other numbers of very large numbers that you can see in terms of potential. And yet, the sort of reality is that when you look at the actual amount of funds that are flowing, either from the official sector or from the private sector to support this green transition in emerging markets, numbers are not very large, and they're also not growing very fast. And I think that raises two questions. One is how are we going to close the gap? That's a substantive point. And the second is, to what extent is this sort of continued disconnect actually between needs and reality, in fact, itself becoming an impediment for the credibility of this whole conversation?
Sure.
Are people beginning to say, look, this is all meaningless, so these numbers. How do you think about this issue, and what, if anything, can the US Treasury do to help move this forward?
So we do think about the issue, and it's clear from your question that you do as well, and that many in this space, and I'm sure on the other end of these cameras do as well. I think we think about it. Well, we think about it every day, and we think about it in three, I think, separate ways. One is the question of how do we enhance public support and our public budget dollars to assist in development broadly, but energy transition and climate-related investments in particular for the purpose of this conversation. The second is we think about how can public dollars be used to more effectively mobilize and leverage private capital for the same purpose, for development and for climate-related investment. And the third is how do we draw in more pure private capital into markets? Because as you know, the numbers that you just laid out and that we look at every day are not numbers that can be achieved or should be achieved with public dollars alone. Right. At the end of the day, this has to be. We will only be successful in this battle if we are able to mobilize private capital at true scale. And so I think we think about those activities in three different buckets. On the first, on public capital, you will have seen that the President has committed to a fourfold increase in our public budget dollars towards international climate change efforts, increasing that to over $11 billion. Of course, that will require congressional action, and we are hopeful that stakeholders will understand just how important this agenda is, and we're hopeful that Congress will as well. At the end of the day, this is both an environmental imperative, a moral imperative, but also, as you said, is the pathway for economic development in countries around the world. And underneath that economic development is tremendous economic potential and economic growth potential for investors who see that possibility. So that's the first bucket is public finance. The second is how do we use our public dollars more effectively to leverage private dollars? In that first category, there will always be types of investments where it's very hard to get private capital to flow. Right. I'm thinking of a small off-grid run-of-river, hydro project in a very poor landlocked African country. It's very hard to get a pension fund in the US to say, yeah, I'm going to put my money into that investment. But there are investments that the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, the IFIs do all the time where there is the potential to crowd in much more private capital. So Secretary Yellen convened the heads of the MDBs twice last year in person to ask them to come up with plans to enhance their capital mobilization strategies. Very specifically, how do you align your incentives internally to catalyze more private capital on the back of each public dollar? What types of incentives can you put in place? What types of investments, what types of partnerships can you forge with private investors who have an interest in climate, in renewable energy, in electric vehicle, in low carbon transportation, in partnership with the MDBs. And I would just say, without going into too much detail, those conversations have yielded results. We've seen different levels of ambition and plans come out of the MDBs as a result of those conversations. And then finally, this last bucket, perhaps the biggest, is this 130 trillion, as you mentioned, Masood. 130 trillion is the number of the amount of assets under management globally that have, under the GFANZ, the Glasgow Agreement that was headed by Mark Carney, have made net zero commitments by 2050. That capital needs to find places to go to satisfy its commitment. That association has a emerging markets work stream associated with it, headed by a number of quite reputable and large financial institutions that are looking for ways to place their capital and invest their capital at scale in emerging markets. So we spend a fair bit of time with that organization helping think through what types of partnerships and structures can we put in place, what types of enabling environments do we need to encourage in countries around the world to unlock that capital. So at a high level, that's how I'd say. And then we have some specific programs that I can talk about as well that perhaps later in the conversation.
We'll get to those. But you talked about the IFIs, the international financial institutions, and the development banks in particular. And as you say, Secretary Yellen convened twice last year, heads of the multilateral development banks. And I want to come back more recent. In the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, which took place a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Yellen made some statements. First in a speech that was just preceding the meetings, and then in her statement to the IMFC and the Development Committee, which are the sort of ministerial committees that oversee these institutions. And I thought that her statements there certainly went further than I had seen before, both in terms of sort of recognizing that the development banks needed to change in almost, I would say, non-incremental ways. I mean, it's almost like a fundamentally different vision. Say, look, in addition to doing country-by-country poverty work, you need to think about global challenges. You need to think about working across countries. You need to be focused on mobilization. And I mean, I'm not going to spend time quoting the speech at length, but I mean, she did say, just to say one sentence, going forward, we need to evolve the development finance system, including the World Bank and the regional development banks, to our changing world, in particular to better mobilize private capital and fund global public good. Mm-hmm. So that's a very clear sense of direction. And then she had some more specific points that she wanted to make about the World Bank itself. I want to get a little bit of a sense of how is the Treasury and the U.S. administration more broadly? I mean, the United States is the largest shareholder in these institutions. How is the United States administration and Treasury now planning to advance this vision for these development banks? Because, first of all, is that a vision that's broadly shared by other shareholders? If not, how do you build consensus around it? So I want to get a little bit of your sense of, this is the direction that you would like them to move in. How do you see that moving forward now?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and there's a lot below it, and we could do a whole session on it, and perhaps we should. Perhaps we should later with another of my colleagues who's kind of running that agenda within Treasury. But I think First of all, I'm glad her words were noted because the Secretary is spending a lot of time. The Treasury is the voice and the vote of the U.S. government at the MDBs and IFIs, for those in the audience who might not know that. So we sit on the boards and express the U.S. position across the MDBs and DFIs. It is clear that the question of how the banks broadly use their capital to be more catalytic, to increase the development impact, whether it's on food security or pandemic preparedness or on climate change, is something that is on the mind of the Secretary. And we feel across a Treasury and the administration that the MDBs could be doing and should be doing a better job in leveraging their impact and mobilizing private capital. And that's consistent with the convening that the Secretary led last year on 2 occasions with the heads of the MDBs. I think this notion of how the banks provide public goods as a category of service for developing countries is one that, again, the Secretary is very interested in and is really just now beginning that conversation with the banks about what is possible and about where we would like to see them reorient and prioritize going forward. As it relates to climate, we've made our requests and our agenda quite clear, not just for ourselves, but for other shareholders stakeholders in the banks who then have similar views. So on climate, we've talked about increasing the rates of private capital mobilization. We've talked about increasing their focus on adaptation as opposed to simply mitigation within the agenda. Developing plans to align their policy-based lending with the Paris goals and with climate goals of countries. The banks do incredibly good work on policy-based lending. We'd like to see more climate-related lending provisions put in those loans. And we'd like to see the development of local capital markets and green bond markets. And we think that the banks are well positioned to help lead a lot of that work. So we have a very clear set of priorities that we've made clear to the banks, made clear to the other stakeholders. And I think this is a year where we'll be progressing that conversation with the heads of the institutions and with other stakeholders.
And do you find in the conversations that you've had that there is, on the side of these institutions, a degree of responsiveness to recognizing that their own role has to change and adapt going forward? I mean, how much, so when you say, we're going to be having these conversations this year, do you see this essentially as sort of moving forward to do the design of how do you make all this happen, or is this still the upstream end of trying to get people to buy into that this is what these institutions should be doing, or a bit of both, probably?
I think it's probably a little bit of both, but yeah. I think as you probably know better than just about anyone on earth, these institutions have a lot of demands on their priorities and times, and so I think if you throw 100 requests at an MDB, it's hard to know quite what to do with that. Yeah. If it's 5 or 6 and they're hearing it from not just the U.S. but from 5 or 6 large shareholders, then it has a different weight. And so I think we're probably closer into that process now, prioritizing and in the substantive conversations of what that should look like.
Maybe just talk a little bit about 2 kinds of developing country perspectives. One is if you take the sub-Saharan Africa, look at the small, poorest countries, they don't use much energy, and their biggest problem right now is access to energy to be able to actually increase incomes and develop. I think when Secretary Kerry was here, he said that the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa account for about 0.5% of global emissions. And I would say that there's almost no plausible development scenario for them in which, even with the best and the most optimistic projections that they will account for substantial contribution to global emissions in the next 50 years. So for them, the priority is adaptation for many of them, but it's also how do you get an energy mix that will help to develop their economies going forward. And in that context, one of the topics that keeps coming up, and I want to get your view on this, is the use of natural gas. We are, of course, relying very heavily on natural gas right now in Europe, in the United States, and indeed we see it as a better alternative right now than oil and certainly coal and I think a lot of developing countries also see natural gas, in some cases oil, as part of their energy mix going forward. But the messages from the United States and from other large countries have sometimes been a bit mixed on this insofar as the energy growth in Africa is concerned. Secretary Kerry was very, I think, clear on it. He sort of said, look, he thought that it made sense for these countries, at least the way I heard what he said was that he thought it made sense for them to rely on it as part of as long as there was abatement down the road. I'm not sure that message is what the IFIs are always conveying to the developing countries. And I was wondering how you in Treasury are thinking about this now. Do you have a sort of clear line on it? And if there's a clear line, is that clearly understood by the IFIs for whom you are, as you say, the voice and the vote, right? I mean, so I want to get a little bit your take on that issue.
Yeah, it's another great question and a timely one. The first thing I'd say is President Biden made it very clear when he came into office in, I believe, the first executive order, I think it was in January, that his priorities were about ending public support for fossil fuels, period. I mean, that was that. Now it's a question of over what period of time and what that would look like. But along with his plan to have the U.S. be a net zero in the electricity sector by 2035 and net zero as a country by 2050, it should come as no surprise that our direction of travel and his policies and all of his agenda have been around legislation that would move us in that direction and get us to those targets. The question was then, how do we carry that policy through to our voice and vote at the development banks? And we issued a new set of guidance last summer. Secretary Yellen issued this that basically constrains our ability to support projects in those MDBs. Certainly no coal, certainly no oil, and in gas we put significant restrictions on it. But I think it is important to point out that those restrictions are not let's just say airtight. We allow for the banks to support, the MDBs to support gas projects in over 100 countries. So IDA eligible countries, where there is strong alternatives analysis that show that there is no other viable, economically viable energy option. And where those investments would be consistent with that country's own Paris targets or their own NDCs. So I think it is important to say that our guidance is nuanced. It is very clearly stating a strong preference away from fossil fuel, and it raises the burden of proof on a developer or on an investor or on a country to say, if you want to do gas, you have to show that there's no viable alternative. But in the event that there's no viable alternative, we are able to, through our voice and vote, support projects around the world in this area. I think what Secretary Kerry said I looked carefully at it and I spoke with I actually spoke with him and his team on it as well. What Secretary Kerry said was there may be a short-term opportunity for gas, but absent abatement, you're going to be building stranded assets.
Absolutely.
And so be careful about investing into new gas now. Because absent strong abatement, which means CCUS or some other technology, you're going to be in a position in a short period of time where those assets are no longer, become a liability to your country, to your system, et cetera.
And I think that's absolutely right. And thank you for being more precise about that than I was. But also, I really think what you just said is very important, that it is a nuanced position, and the guidance that has been issued, that is what is intended. And I don't know how many people are watching this directly, but it is important that people recognize that, because that's not always, the difficulty with nuanced guidance is that the nuances are sometimes not so obvious by the time it works its way through the supply chain, if you like. And these days, as we know, supply chains are under a lot of pressure. So it's important for people to hear directly what you've just said, and I thank you for it.
Masoud, can I just take one step further there, because I think it's important. I mean, I think investors see, I know this because we meet with them every day, see a very clear direction of travel here.
Right.
We have now an historic alignment of policy, economics, and finance that we've never had before with respect to long-term, and in some cases quite intermediate term, 2030 targets for decarbonization, both at the country level and increasingly at the corporate and financial institution level. So it is, if you are an investor or a project developer thinking about a project or an investment that has a 10 or 15 or 20-year payback or lifetime to it, you have to be thinking about the regulatory environment that you're not just dealing with today, but that you will be dealing with 20 years from now. And so it is not only the case that public finance is appropriately, in my belief, making it harder to access finance for fossil fuels,
Right,
per the administration's early policy. But private markets are doing the same, and arguably private markets are doing it in some cases faster. And so I just want to point that out, that private markets around the world could be investing in Africa today into gas markets if they wanted to. We would have no say in that. They're not, for some reason. And part of that reason, I believe, is that they see the direction of travel and see this notion of stranded assets as one that's concerning to them.
Yes. No. So I think just maybe two things that I do want to say on that. One is that I think it's absolutely right that the politics is hard in many countries. It's hard here to get consensus on moving forward at the speed and with the level of ambition that the administration wants. It's hard in other countries. It's hard in developing countries to make the case. And we haven't talked much about this, but international coordination is hard. I mean, there's no way we're going to solve any of this global climate change issue without engaging with and having some kind of coordinated approach with the large emitters, which include China. So and U.S.-China relations is a little bit difficult in that context to have this, but that's clearly hard. But the technology is moving us in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Every month you get better, cheaper technology in clean energy, in clean development, and the markets are moving us there because that is what they expect. So in the end, that is what is driving the process. So I take that point very much. The one little point I would say about private investors aren't rushing in to finance gas projects in Africa because they're worried about long-term or what's going to happen to the regulatory environment. They may end up with stranded assets. It's not as if they're rushing in to finance other things in those countries either, right? So it may well be that it makes complete sense to say don't want to use public money for fossil fuels in countries where private money and private markets work well, but in countries where the private finance is hard to get going without some kind of public involvement through the MDBs, my only point would be there's no reason to single out gas as being any different from investing in infrastructure for those people. So that's just a little nuance. All right, now I want to make sure we actually have a chance to bring in people who have been watching. I'm going to try and see if the technology works, that I have access to some of the comments in here. questions that have come in, and let's see. I think the one. All right, here's one that I wanted to come to you on, please, if I may. And this is actually a question about this project in South Africa, which came out of Glasgow, the just energy transition. And as I understand it, what this is getting at is that there was a proposal that came out of Glasgow to help a few countries that are very heavily dependent on coal for their energy use and for electricity in particular, to move away to cleaner fuels. And sort of South Africa then partnered up with the US, Britain, France, Germany, EU, and some others to have this just energy transition partnership, which would help them in an accelerated way to decarbonize, move away from coal, if you like. And this was supposed to be sort of the first of these prototypes, if you like, that could be used for other countries, whether it's Indonesia or Vietnam or India, which are all very heavily dependent on coal. And this was set up. It required about $8.5 billion in grants and cheap loans that were going to help, concessional loans that were going to help make this feasible. Now here we are a few months later, and I was at a meeting just a few weeks ago where we had somebody who spoke eloquently about this as a way for the future and how much it could have an impact. But then there was somebody else there as well who's all quite knowledgeable, who basically said, look, this is all talk. Frankly, there's no money moving it so far. What we have is a nice machine that we've created, but we don't have any real progress. So I know you have been very much involved in it. Sort of, A, where do you want to come out on that spectrum of views? And B, how can we get closer going forward to one end of that?
Thanks for the question. It's a great question, and it's a project or program or partnership that I've been very involved with. In fact, before government as well. Look, the notion of what we're calling these JETPs, Just Energy Transition Partnerships, is to identify initially a small handful of countries who are predominantly high coal emitting countries, who have a strong policy interest and strong political commitment in expediting their transition away from coal and towards clean and green renewables, and where the size and scope of the financing need to expedite that transition is larger than any single country on its own with its public resources can support. So the concept of JETP is to aggregate funding in support of a very ambitious decarbonization agenda that requires a partnership approach. And South Africa was the first, and we brought together, as you said, France, UK, Germany, the EU, and the US, and made an announcement at COP. And the announcement was the following. We, the collective group here, are committing $8.5 billion over a 3 to 5 year period to support South Africa's just energy transition plan, and that over the year, beginning last October and concluding this October, we would
next COP that's going to happen in Sharm el Sheikh.
Correct. We would collectively work on a investment plan that would lay out the structure and the guidelines for how those funds would be deployed. So I am happy to report that, not surprisingly to those of you who haven't been tracking this every day, that over the last 6 months, we've made a lot of progress. And the South African government has organized itself around this. They have appointed a very senior task team that includes members from the President's office, members from the financial sector, members from various ministries to be our counterparts. We have appointed a secretariat to develop the investment plan, and we are in, I would say, weekly, if not daily, contact with our counterparts on the ground as that process develops. A lot of the eyes of the world are on this in the sense that we need this to succeed, to be successful, this first partnership. At the same time, we are now beginning to work with the Indonesians. Secretary Yellen had very, very constructive conversations with Sri Mulyani, the finance minister, and coordinating Minister Luhut and his delegation while they were here during Bank Fund meetings. And so I was in the region just about 6 weeks ago. So Indonesia will be our next partnership. India, we're also working with our European partners in Vietnam and Senegal. Those have been the initial countries that have been selected to be JETP partners.
Right.
So I'm very optimistic about the notion of committing large amounts of capital to incentivize expedited energy transitions in high-emitting countries. Unless we figure out ways of decommissioning high-emitting assets quickly, we will not get to our Paris goals. And that's what these programs are really set up to do.
Yeah. So I think that's fantastic. And I think the concept makes a lot of sense. The consequence, if we did this successfully in just those 5 countries, would be pretty big for the global trajectory on emissions. If you can then also see action in some of the other high emitters like China, which don't need to have the financing brought together in this way, then you can begin to see a different outcome for the world. It makes sense to focus on a few and really work together and get that done. I think I guess the question that is still in the back of my mind is, so we're going to get to Sharm el-Sheikh. Everybody's going to be expecting to see that this first partnership is kind of, where has it got to by then? You know, have we got the investment plan, and do we have the $8.5 billion reasonably identified and tied up? Is it happening, or is it, you know, essentially not quite there yet? And you remember how much energy and time has been spent around this 100 billion number, which is for, you know, what the world was supposed to provide, rich world was committed to provide to developing countries for climate, and there's disputes about what's in it and what's not in it and how much it is, et cetera. It became a little bit of an icon in itself.
Sure.
And I guess my question still to you is, are you feeling confident that when we get to Sharm el-Sheikh, this particular first partnership will be at a point where you say, yeah, look, this model is delivering. It's not just a great concept, but it's actually following through.
Am I confident? I am confident that we have the right people on the South African side and the right people on our side and with our partners to make the best possible push for a substantive outcome in the next 6 months. That's what I'm confident of.
Yeah.
If this were easy, it would have been done years ago.
Of course.
Countries could have managed this on their own. If this were consistent with the bilateral agenda of any single country, we would have done this 10 years ago. We're talking about economy-wide economic transitions of energy sectors, which are hugely political beasts, not just in South Africa, but are in our own country. So these are very complex partnerships, dealing with labor, with affected communities. We need to ensure that Masood, this investment plan we put together has strong, just transition elements so that we are allocating the right amount of funding and support for communities that will be affected by this expedited transition away from coal. So these are very complicated issues. I can't predict what the final investment plan will look like, but I can predict to you that there will be a significant amount of pressure on the team to produce a high-quality output, precisely because there's so much attention from you and organizations like yours and us on the outcome. And we have hopes that this will be a model for what we can do in other countries.
And I would say from developing countries.
Absolutely.
Because if I could just generalize from this for a minute, I do worry that one of the big casualties of the patchy, inadequate international response to first COVID, then the food and fuel crisis that we're seeing now, then the climate finance agenda over the last few years, has been an erosion of trust in the international system by many developing country policymakers. Mm-hmm. And I think that that doesn't augur well for embarking on cooperative projects going forward, because you start with a bit of a trust deficit, where people no longer believe that the system is really designed to help them as much. And, it's hard to, I think somebody said that trust kind of leaves very quickly and takes a long time to come back. I think we're at a bit of a tipping point on this personally. And in some ways, on climate, coming up to the next COP, which is sort of seen as Africa's COP as well, because it's going to be in Africa and emerging markets will want to see some action there. This is certainly one of the projects that will help to determine in people's minds whether this agenda is actually making progress in ways that respond to them or not. So I'm very happy to hear that I know what it would pay. I mean, I'm sure you're not attempting to put more pressure on the team, but just to hear that they are engaged and focused on it.
And we met with the Egyptians last week, and we heard the same message there, which was that we need to see progress on this front, because it's a model of what we think could be done in the future as well. So point taken from you and from others as well.
I think I'm just conveying what I hear on this, but for me, it's not just in itself important, but it's also the sort of nail in the coffin of trust, that I see that this is becoming another source where people then just say, look, none of this stuff really adds up. And that we can't afford that, because there's so much that needs to be done that does require cooperative action. Now, we certainly have a flurry of questions. We have 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm going to give you, maybe we could end on this one point, which comes back a bit to your role in Treasury. Right? We've talked about the whole of government approach, and there are different parts of the administration. Well, Secretary Kerry is there; he's a climate envoy, that are focused on this. How much do you? First of all, how do you sort of see all this coming together? But secondly, how do you work? How far can you actually work on mitigation in the sort of U.S. itself beyond the financial sector that we talked about? You work through the financial sector. So that's a couple of questions that I want to end with, which is, how does this whole of government approach come together in practice?
Yeah, it's a great question, and with the minute that I have left, I'll take a quick swing at it. I mean, obviously, this administration has prioritized climate in its budgeting, in its staffing, in its structure, unlike any other, and I think that's notable in and of itself. And so I think in the early months of the administration, there's a lot of figuring out who the new players are, as there is in any new administration, and how do we work well together. I think on the international side, Treasury works quite seamlessly with the with Kerry's team, the SPEC, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, and so we have a very strong working relationship with them. On the domestic front, we work across so many different agencies when it comes to our work, both the regulatory agencies that we talked about earlier, but also Department of Agriculture, Department of Housing. Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, in both administering government programs and spending plans, but also in designing policies that are consistent with the administration's policy. So it's a hard one to answer in 30 seconds, but we're doing well.
All right. Well, the main thing is that it seems, at least from what you're saying, to be broadly working as best as any of these structures can be expected.
I think that's the case, and I think again, given the level of priority that we're putting on this issue, this is an issue that is being discussed, debated, met on in what we call IPCs, policy committees across the administration on a daily basis, with very strong working relationships.
I think we've run out of time, John. So, John Morton, I want to thank you for taking the time to come and meet with us. I found this to be a really fascinating and insightful conversation. I'm sure that the people who are watching this will find it to be the same. And we should set a date to meet after Sharm el-Sheikh, because I think that'll be a good time to take stock towards the end of this year on just how far we come, how much did the hopefully temporary deviation from the trend that's going to be caused by the current war in Ukraine, how is that impacting medium-term trajectories, and how you are seeing the world of climate finance, the U.S.'s role in that going forward.
Happy to do that. Yeah.
Great.
Good.
Thanks.
Thank you, Masood. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody.